Today, I finally want to talk to you about the artist of my lifetime, an artist whose work has been incredibly precious to me in ways that I do not fully have words for, whose work has shaped me, saved me, and helped me feel seen in the specific agony of living in a complex mind. This artist has taught me about the pain and the beauty of existing on this planet, about suffering, about survival, and about the beauty that can exist inside endurance. I want to introduce you guys to my personal favorite artist, Sufjan Stevens, one of the greatest songwriters of our time, who many of you don't know because he didn't really want to be known, but that does not make his work any less important or any less extraordinary. So let's get started. So I think I want to tell you guys, like, relative to Sufjan Stevens, like, what my relationship with this artist is. I've been following this man's career for over 20 years now, and I was deeply involved in the Tumblr fan community space, kind of culminating in me running the Fuck Yeah Sufjan Stevens blog during the Carrie and Lowell era. I did not make that blog what it was, but I did run it during Carrie and Lowell. And yeah, when I say he's the artist of my lifetime, I mean it very literally. I think that this man's music has been with me through all different phases of my life, and he's older than me, so it's almost as if he's sort of traveled this challenging path ahead of the way, and in some of the most difficult times of my life has made it through to the other side and shown me that I too can, like, survive. So anyway, that's who he is to me. So who is Sufjan Stevens? Sufjan Stevens is a singer-songwriter and indie darling and one of the most critically beloved artists of the early 2000s. He grew up in Michigan and went to Hope College, which is a Christian school, which is important because, like, his faith is a big part of his life. He got an MFA in creative writing from the New School in New York, and his primary vocation started off as a writer. Songwriting is simply just the form that his primary vocation of being a writer found, right? He's written a bunch of short stories, actually, that are actually genuinely excellent and are buried in the internet, including on, fun fact, Fuck Yeah Sufjan Stevens. His breakthrough kind of came about when he announced the 50 States project. That was probably his album Michigan, I believe, was his third album. And he was going to, basically, he claimed that he was going to write an album about every state in the union, starting with Michigan and then following up with what I would describe as probably his magnum opus, Illinois. He later on said in his career that the 50 States thing was just a marketing gimmick and that he never intended to do that. I personally don't know if I actually believe him. I think that early on in Sufjan's career, he was ambitious enough and expansive enough to think that over the course of his life, he could build an album about all 50 states. And I think he's very deeply fascinated with, like, Americana and what it means to be American. That I can imagine there was a time where he actually, like, took it seriously, but I think he got kind of pissed off with people trying to hold him to it, and so he got sick of talking about it, okay? But I think that the geographic-based frame never really left him. If you actually look at Carrie and Lowell, which is another one of his, like, best albums, like, it's really hard to say what his best album is. He has so many great pieces of work. But if you look at Carrie and Lowell is very much based in Oregon. So in a sense, that album almost serves as, like, an Oregon album to me, although it's obviously about the death of his estranged mother and sort of the crater that she left in his soul afterwards. But Illinois in 2005 is widely considered to be Sufjan Stevens' magnum opus. It is basically on any serious greatest albums of the past, like, century list, like, Illinois is on it. If the album is not on the list, then it's not a serious list. Cough, Apple Music, cough, okay? It's probably one of the most celebrated records, probably one of his most widely celebrated records. So Sufjan is also an independent artist. He runs his own label, Asthmatic Kitty, that he used to actually run with his stepfather, Lowell. In that label, he also, elevates artists who kind of share his same sensibility, but he also, it's part of Sufjan's thing is that he's in control of all aspects of his work. He writes his own songs, he plays his own instruments, he mixes his own vocals, he produces his own music, and he distributes his own music as well through his label, Asthmatic Kitty. And I think that's, like, pretty cool. At the height of his fame coincided quite specifically with the height of the Tumblr era, and I would be a happy identifier as someone who was very much a part of that Tumblr community. And it was actually probably one of my first, like, major online community identities. And it drew a very specific type of person. We all had complex emotional lives. We were sensitive, we were thoughtful, and also had expansive imaginations and a love of, honestly, like, the English language. I also think in a more painful way, something that we all tend to struggle with is feeling distant or perhaps even unloved by our families of origin, and a lot of us didn't have a sense of belonging in the world. I think a lot of folks in the Sufjan community were also queer and struggling with their sexual identity, which is something that we'll get to later on in this video essay. But I think a lot of us were people who may have looked like, everyday people on the outside, but whose interior lives were radically different and made us feel different and separate from the rest of the world. But I think in our community, And with Sufjan, we realized that, we really weren't alone, that shared sort of psychic ache really knitted us together. And it's ultimately what his music like fundamentally is about. And what is Sufjan's music fundamentally about? I would say that his music is about the existential pain of being alive, the ache of existing in a world that does not explain itself, and that is fundamentally unjust, and that is fundamentally full of suffering. Like, life is suffering, I think that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the music where you hold your faith and your reality in the same two hands and watch them kind of contradict each other. I think that there's a lot of themes of desire, of longing, of love, of self-loathing, of loss, of grief, and love that is never able to sort of fully fill the crater left behind by the absence of love from the family of origin. I think a lot of Sufjan's work also concerns his faith, right? Like, Sufjan is deeply and seriously Christian, and last I've heard, he still retained his sort of belief in his faith. Hope College was a Christian school, as I mentioned before, and his faith is a through line of his entire catalog. But I think that his faith for him was very much kind of like a double-edged sword. On one side, I think it was refuge, it was sanctuary, it was community, it was belief in something higher, a reason for living, of a system of meaning, right? A connection with the divine. On the other hand, I think it also served as like a white hot pincer of shame. And I think many of us who grew up in the church fundamentally understand this duality. And I think that a lot of us who were drawn to the fan community did kind of grow up in the church and had these sort of what I would describe as like a tumultuous and complex relationships with the divine. I would say, at least for not everybody who I think was drawn to Sufjan's music, like remained in the church the way that he did, but I think that that aspect of the identity was something that I feel like his music really did like address and touch on. Another thing I think that's important to talk about when talking about Sufjan Stevens, and I think now that he's finally spoken about it, once Javelin was released, he spoke about it, is his queer identity, okay? For the duration of Sufjan's career, he really did wrestle with his queer identity. And you have to understand that in the early 2000s, we lived in a very different world when it came to queerness and sexuality that did not fit sort of heteronormative norms, basically. It was a much more difficult thing, and there was far more persecution and far more shame. And I think that Sufjan strongly identifying as a Christian probably only amplified that more, because there's a lot of parts of the Christian church that just like basically view homosexuality as like a sin, and that was something that was way louder when we were growing up, and perhaps it is maybe now, even though it's still a problem in some parts of the church. I think for us though, like, it was something that he never discussed, and it was off limits, and it was not something that he was willing to talk about. And I think that us as a fan community were fiercely protective of that. We did not push, we did not pry, and because in the music, if you really listen to the work, you could feel that it was a live wire, a source of, as I mentioned, like this like white hot pincer of shame, something that was unresolved, and a tension that underpinned a lot of his work. I think like some of the most salient examples of this are All for Myself from Age of Odds, Alan and Tanager from All Delighted People, Predatory Wasp of the Palisades from Illinois, John My Beloved from Carrie and Lowell. Like, this was something that really was a source of agony and tension and pain in his life. Sufjan, around the Carrie and Lowell era, so circa 2014, started openly, at least among his friends, was open about his sexuality, but he never, ever addressed it or admitted it to the public, despite the fact that he had a partner, Evans Richards III, who has since passed, unfortunately, who they were together for like, I don't know, something like 14 years, like 12 years, I can't remember. And Evans actually tragically died just before Javelin came out in April of 2023, and Sufjan, for the first time in his entire career, acknowledged that he had a male partner just before Javelin came out in October of 2023, almost 20 years into his career. Anyway, this video is getting rather long, so in the next part, I want to talk to you guys about maybe why you don't actually know about Sufjan Stevens, as well as provide a intro to Sufjan listening guide, which it is my pleasure to turn people on to one of the greatest artists of our time. So thank you for joining me for this. It was a pleasure to talk about my favorite artist of all time, and I hope you guys join me for the next one. I'll see you next time. Bye.